and he recognizes that King Richard will not be easily defeated like the Christians he had fought in the past. Richard loses around 700 men in the Battle of Arsuf, while Saladin loses around 7,000 in defeat. The Crusaders celebrate their victory and continue on towards Jaffa, unaware that their destination would become the stage for the epic final showdown between the two legendary commanders. Richard and the Crusaders make it to Jaffa and quickly work to repair the fallen city. Saladin's scouts report on the progress made by the Christians, and he realizes that Richard is trying to set up a string of supply stations to Jerusalem. If Richard is able to do this, defending the holy city against a well-fed and well-supplied army of Crusaders will be near impossible. The battle at Arsuf has shown the battlefield abilities of the Christian king, so Saladin changes his strategy from direct combat to sabotage. He's about to show Richard that there are levels to this game of war. Saladin begins by destroying every port city and town en route to Jerusalem, starting with Ascalon, Richard's logical next destination. He knows that this will do two things. It'll force Richard to spend more time and resources building their own staging areas, and he's banking that the Crusaders will grow frustrated by the delays. Just as planned, Richard spent months refortifying Ascalon and spent more time fixing the destroyed forts along the road to Jerusalem. As time passed, the Crusaders became increasingly frustrated by the lack of action. They came here to fight, not to work as laborers, and Saladin's plan is playing out exactly as he thought it would. Throughout the entire time Richard was setting up supply lines, Saladin continued his hit-and-run tactics, which sunk Crusader spirits even further, and soon some of the knights began to leave and head back to other Christian cities in the area. Richard finds himself stuck between a rock and a hard place. He knows he needs logistics for any chance of success, but none of the other Crusaders seem to get it. They want to fight! They want to take Jerusalem! So eventually, they force Richard to make 2 attempts to recapture the holy city, once getting within 12 miles of their goal. But both times, he turns them around when he realizes the risks are far too great. Seeing Jerusalem with their own eyes and then having to turn around without even attempting to take it crushes the last bits of morale amongst the Crusaders. Richard pitches a plan to take Egypt to cut off Saladin's supply lines, but they've lost faith in his leadership and refuse. Ironically, the only person who seems to get him is Saladin, and this is where the dynamics between the two leaders starts to get very interesting. See, both Richard and Saladin had been sending envoys to each other this whole time, trying to come to some sort of an understanding. And through these interactions, both Richard and Saladin begin to see their enemy in a new light. Saladin would often send his brother Al-Adil as the chief negotiator, and he and Richard actually became really good friends. So much so that Richard even offers up a plan where Al-Adil marries his sister to create peace through marriage. He didn't bother to ask his sister for her input on this arrangement, but hey, I guess it was a nice gesture. Through his friendship with Al-Adil, Richard's feelings towards the Muslims begins to evolve. They're not the monsters people in Europe said they were. Al-Adil is f***ing cool, and his brother Saladin, well, he's a wise and honorable king. But he can't really say this stuff out loud to his men. The rest of the Crusaders don't really feel the same, and they're getting more and more pissed that Richard is still not leading them to retake Jerusalem. Oh, and to make matters even worse, remember his frenemy King Philip of France? Well, Richard gets word that back in Europe, that dickhead is now working on a plan with his own brother Prince John, aka the bad guy in Robin Hood, to steal his throne and his lands while he's away in the Middle East. F***ing fantastic. Ugh. Everything seems to be falling apart for Richard. Despite not losing a single battle against the Muslims, Saladin's strategy had worked perfectly, and he has him on the ropes. Now under immense pressure, Richard needs to wrap this crusade up quick, and he travels to Acre to rally the additional troops he needs. Saladin is notified by his scouts that Richard's away, and he finally sees the opportunity he had been waiting for this whole time. With Richard in Acre, Jaffa was left almost completely undefended, and if he were to capture the city, Richard would be forced to try to take it again. The Crusaders would revolt to this plan, and without an army, the king's time in the Holy Land would be done. A complete victory without even having to fight him on the battlefield. And so Saladin quickly moves his forces to Jaffa to deliver the knockout punch. On the morning of July 27, 1192, the defenders at Jaffa wake up to the sights and sounds of an enormous Muslim army outside their walls. Saladin wastes no time and orders a full-out assault on the city. The Christians quickly send off a messenger to Acre and pray that he'll reach Richard before it's too late. The defenders do their best to hold off Saladin, fighting bravely though massively outnumbered, but the walls are soon breached and the Muslims storm their way into the city within 3 days. Fighting breaks out on the streets and surviving Crusaders are driven back into the citadel. The exhausted messenger sent from Jaffa reaches Acre in record time and delivers the dire news to Richard. He quickly gathers as many men as he can find and they board ships to make a beeline back to Jaffa. He understands the stakes as well as Saladin. If he doesn't make it in time, everything he had worked so hard for over the past year and a half would be for nothing. They arrive at Jaffa on August 1st, but the Crusaders begin to hang their heads in defeat when they see Saladin's flags flying on the city walls. They're too late. But suddenly, in the distance, Richard sees a man frantically swimming towards their ship. They pull him up, and he turns out to be a priest who was in Jaffa at the time of the attack. He tells them that hope is not lost. The Christians still live and are in the citadel waiting for you. They're ready to fight on. And upon hearing this, Richard grabs a crossbow and his sword, jumps off the ship, and begins to wade toward the shore. The knights on board follow his lead, and together they fearlessly advance directly towards the Muslim camp outside the city. Richard reaches shore, and he quickly unloads a crossbow bolt into the first Muslim he sees. He then draws his sword and rushes headfirst into Saladin's camp. The Crusaders, swords drawn, follow their king, and they engage the shocked Muslims in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Saladin's men cannot believe the boldness of these knights, and Richard leads from the front, hacking and slashing his way towards the city walls. The banner of the Lionheart is carried into battle as more and more Crusaders follow Richard's lead and begin jumping off their ships and wading to shore. Richard and his initial strike force make it into the city, and fighting breaks out on every street. The Christians in the citadel, hearing the sounds of combat, are startled from their stupor. They peer out and see the flag of King Richard flying in the wind and are filled with his courage. They pour out of the citadel and join their fellow Crusaders in battle, now unafraid of death itself.